Sometimes the most dangerous person in any conflict isn't the one who planned to be there. Sometimes it's the tourist who got caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, carrying skills nobody expected and a determination that surprises everyone, including themselves. When visiting researcher Dr. Sarah Chun accepted an invitation to observe a routine patrol in the Kandahar province, she thought she'd spend a quiet afternoon taking notes about military logistics for her dissertation. She never imagined she'd end up saving an entire squad of battle-hardened Marines with nothing but a borrowed rifle and 20 years of hunting experience from her childhood in rural Montana. This is the story of how a visiting academic became the most talked-about civilian in Marine Corps history, and how one perfectly placed shot changed everything. Dr. Sarah Chun adjusted the strap of her borrowed helmet for the third time in 10 minutes, trying to find a position that didn't make her neck ache. The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the small convoy of armored vehicles as they rolled through the dusty roads of Kandahar province. She clutched her notebook tightly, filled with observations about military supply chains and logistics operations that would hopefully become the backbone of her doctoral dissertation. "You doing okay back there, Doc?" called out Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez from the front passenger seat of the MRAP. His weathered face showed genuine concern as he glanced back at their unusual passenger. "Fine, thank you," Sarah replied, though her voice betrayed her nervousness. At 28, she had spent most of her adult life in university libraries and research labs, not bouncing around Afghanistan in an armored vehicle with a squad of Marines. "This is definitely different from my usual field work." The other Marines in the vehicle chuckled good-naturedly. They had been curious about their civilian observer when she first arrived at Forward Operating Base, Shank, 3 days ago. Dr. Chun was there as part of a Defense Department research program, studying how military logistics operations could be improved in remote environments. Her background in operations research and supply chain management had earned her the opportunity, but nothing had quite prepared her for the reality of being embedded with an active combat unit. "Where you from originally, Doc?" asked Corporal Tommy Washington, the youngest member of the squad at 19. Despite his youth, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from 6 months in country. "Montana," Sarah answered, grateful for the distraction from the vehicle's constant rocking motion. "Small town called Whitefish, up near Glacier National Park. Pretty different from this place." "No kidding," laughed Private First Class Jessica Martinez. "I bet you miss the snow about now." Sarah smiled, thinking about the pine forests and mountain lakes of her childhood home. "Actually, I do. Though I have to admit, this landscape has its own kind of beauty. Harsh, but beautiful in its own way." What she didn't mention was how the rolling hills and distant mountains reminded her of hunting trips with her father. Every weekend from the time she turned 12 until she left for college, they would head into the wilderness together. He had taught her to track deer, to read the wind, to judge distances, and compensate for elevation. Most importantly, he had taught her patience and precision with a rifle. Those skills had seemed irrelevant to her academic career, but something about being in this environment brought them rushing back to her memory. Sergeant First Class David Kim, the squad leader, studied the terrain ahead through his binoculars. At 32, he was a veteran of 3 deployments and had the kind of situational awareness that kept people alive. "Coming up on Checkpoint Alpha," he announced to the convoy over the radio. "Everything looks normal, but stay sharp." The convoy consisted of 3 vehicles carrying 12 Marines total, along with Sarah. Their mission was relatively routine, a patrol to check on a remote observation post and deliver some supplies. It was exactly the kind of low-risk operation that made it suitable for a civilian observer to tag along. The intelligence reports had indicated minimal insurgent activity in the area over the past 2 weeks. Sarah continued taking notes, documenting the efficiency of the convoy's movement, the communication protocols, and the way the Marines maintained security while accomplishing their mission. She was particularly interested in how they adapted to unexpected situations and managed their resources in the field. "So what's your dissertation about exactly?" asked Corporal Washington, genuinely curious. "It's focused on optimization of supply chain networks in austere environments," Sarah explained. Basically, how to get the right stuff to the right place at the right time when you're dealing with limited infrastructure and unpredictable conditions. Like getting ammo and water to guys stuck on some mountain in the middle of nowhere, suggested PFC Martinez. Exactly like that, Sarah confirmed. The military does this better than almost any civilian organization, and I'm trying to understand the principles that make it work so I can apply them to disaster relief, remote construction projects, things like that. Sadgyant, Kim Nodit Approvingli. That's actually pretty cool, Doc. We deal with that stuff every day, but I never thought about it as something you could study and improve. The conversation was interrupted by a crackling voice over the radio. Actual, this is Overwatch. Be advised, we've got reports of possible IED activity along Route Phoenix, about 2 clicks south of your position. No immediate threat to your convoy, but maintain elevated alert status. Copy that. Overwatch, Sergeant Kim responded. He turned to his squad. You heard it, people. Eyes open, spacing maintained. Sarah felt her stomach tighten. She had been briefed on the various threats they might encounter, but hearing it discussed in real terms made it suddenly very real. She looked around at the Marines in her vehicle and was struck by how their demeanor had shifted almost imperceptibly. They were still relaxed and professional, but there was a new alertness in their posture, a subtle tension that spoke to their training and experience. Don't worry, Doc, Sergeant Rodriguez said quietly, noticing her expression. We do this all the time. Just part of the job. The convoy continued through a series of small villages, where children sometimes ran alongside the vehicles waving, and adults watched from doorways with expressions that ranged from curious to wary. Sarah documented these interactions, noting how the Marines balance security concerns with their efforts to maintain positive relationships with the local population. The kids always want candy or water, explained Corporal Washington. But we have to be careful about setting patterns or creating situations where crowds gather. Makes security harder. Sarah observed how the squad leader made quick decisions about when to acknowledge the children and when to maintain focus on potential threats. It was a complex calculus that required constant awareness of multiple factors simultaneously. As they approached a narrow valley between 2 ridge lines, Sergeant Kim's voice became more serious. This is where we need to be extra careful, he explained to Sarah. Perfect spot for an ambush if someone wanted to cause trouble. Good fields of fire from the high ground, limited escape routes for us. Sarah studied the terrain with new eyes, trying to see it the way the Marines did. The hills on either side were covered with rocks and scrub vegetation that could easily conceal someone with hostile intentions. She found herself scanning the ridge lines, looking for any sign of movement or anything that seemed out of place. How do you train for this? She asked. I mean, how do you learn to see threats before they become problems? Lots of practice, answered PFC Martinez. And learning from guys who've been doing it longer than you. You develop a feel for when something's not right. Plus, we've got good intel support, added Sergeant Kim. Overwatch keeps an eye on us from above, and we've got electronic surveillance that can pick up things we might miss. As if summoned by his words, the radio crackled again. All units, this is Overwatch. We're showing some unusual thermal signatures on the eastern ridgeline, approximately 400 meters ahead of your position. Could be wildlife, but recommend increased vigilance. Sergeant Kim immediately got on the radio to the other vehicles. All call signs, this is Charlie 1. Reducing speed, maintain spacing, weapons ready, but not engaged. We've got possible activity on the eastern ridge. The atmosphere in the vehicle became noticeably more tense. Sarah could see the Marines checking their weapons and adjusting their positions to have better fields of fire. She felt simultaneously fascinated and terrified by how quickly the situation had shifted from routine patrol to potential combat. Doc, you might want to get down a bit, suggested Sergeant Rodriguez. Just as a precaution. Sarah complied, crouching lower in her seat while trying to continue her observations. This was exactly the kind of real-world situation her research was supposed to help address, but experiencing it firsthand was completely different from reading about it in academic papers. The convoy slowed to a crawl as they entered the narrowest part of the valley. Every Marine was now scanning the high ground through their weapon sights or binoculars. The silence was broken only by the rumble of the engines and the occasional radio check. "Movement on the ridge," called out PFC Martinez quietly. "Eastern side, about 300 meters out." "I see it," confirmed Sergeant Kim. "Could be a goat or something, but we're not taking any chances." He keyed his radio. "Overwatch, Charlie 1. Can you get a better look at that eastern ridgeline? We've got visual on movement, but can't identify." "Charlie 1, standby. Adjusting sensors now." Sarah found herself holding her breath as they waited for the response. She could see the tension in the Marines' faces, the way they were poised to react instantly to whatever developed. Part of her academic mind continued to take notes about decision-making under pressure, but most of her attention was focused on the very real possibility that people might start shooting at them at any moment. The radio finally crackled back to life. "Charlie 1, Overwatch. Thermal imaging shows approximately 6 to 8 human-sized heat signatures in concealed positions along the eastern ridge. Recommend immediate defensive action." Before Sergeant Kim could respond, the world exploded around them. The first rocket-propelled grenade streaked down from the ridge and struck the lead vehicle in the convoy with a thunderous explosion. Sarah felt the shockwave through her body as her vehicle's driver immediately accelerated and swerved toward whatever cover he could find. The sound was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a combination of the explosion itself and the immediate ringing in her ears that followed. "Contact east! Contact east!" Sergeant Kim was shouting into his radio while simultaneously directing his Marines. "Charlie 2 is hit. Charlie 3, provide covering fire. Charlie 1 moving to support." The Marines in Sarah's vehicle immediately began returning fire toward the ridge, their rifles chattering in controlled bursts. Brass casings flew through the air as they engaged targets Sarah couldn't even see among the rocks and vegetation. "Doc, stay down!" Sergeant Rodriguez yelled over the noise. "Keep your head down and stay in the vehicle." Sarah pressed herself against the floor of the MRAP, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her academic training had taught her to observe and analyze, but nothing had prepared her for the chaos and intensity of an actual firefight. The noise was overwhelming, the constant crack of rifles mixed with the deeper boom of the Marines' machine gun and the occasional explosion as grenades detonated among the rocks above. Through the vehicle's small windows, she could see muzzle flashes flickering along the ridgeline as the insurgents continued their attack. The lead vehicle was on fire, but she could see Marines moving around it, some taking cover behind the burning wreck while others worked to extract their wounded comrades. "We need to get up there," Sergeant Kim was saying into his radio. "They've got the high ground and good cover. We can't stay pinned down here." "Negative, Charlie 1, came the response from the convoy commander. "Charlie 2 has wounded that need immediate attention. Establish a perimeter and wait for air support. Air support is 20 minutes out." Kim responded. "Charlie 2's not going to last that long if we don't take pressure off." Sarah watched in fascination and terror as the young sergeant made rapid decisions under impossible circumstances. He had to balance the immediate need to help the wounded Marines with the safety of his own squad and the tactical reality of their situation. The insurgent fire was becoming more accurate as they adjusted their aim. Bullets were striking their vehicle regularly now, and Sarah could hear the distinctive sound of metal hitting metal as rounds impacted the armor plating. "Their position is too good," PFC Martinez called out during a brief lull in the firing. "They can see everything we do from up there, but we can barely see them." That's when Sarah made a decision that would change everything. Despite her fear, despite having no business being involved in a firefight, she found herself thinking about the terrain with the eyes of a hunter rather than an academic. "Sergeant Kim," she called out, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "Not now, Doc," he replied, busy coordinating with the other vehicles. "Sergeant, I think I can help," she insisted. "Help how?" he asked, glancing back at her with a mixture of confusion and irritation. I know something about shooting, Sarah said simply, and I could see a way up that ridge that they might not be watching. For a moment, Sergeant Kim stared at her, as if she had suggested they sprout wings and fly. Then, another burst of enemy fire reminded him of how desperate their situation was becoming. Talk to me, Doc, he said. What are you thinking? Sarah pointed toward a small draw that ran up the western slope of the valley, hidden from the insurgent positions by a rocky outcropping. If someone could get up there with a good rifle, they'd have a clear shot at the insurgent positions. But it would have to be someone who could make the climb quietly and take the shot under pressure. That's a hell of a climb, observed Corporal Washington, following her gaze. And whoever goes up, there's going to be completely on their own. I can make that climb, Sarah said quietly. And I can make that shot. The vehicle fell silent except for the ongoing sounds of battle. Every Marine was staring at her now, trying to process what she had just said. Doc, no offense, Sergeant Rodriguez said carefully, but this isn't a hunting trip. This is combat. People are trying to kill us. I understand that, Sarah replied. But I also understand that if we don't do something, some of your friends are going to die. And right now, I might be the only one who can get into position to help them. Sergeant Kim was studying her face, trying to judge whether she was serious and whether she might actually be capable of what she was proposing. The sound of an explosion from the direction of the lead vehicle helped him make his decision. What do you need? He asked. Sarah's hands were surprisingly steady as Sergeant Kim handed her his M14 enhanced battle rifle. The weapon felt familiar in her grip, similar enough to the hunting rifle she had grown up with that muscle memory took over. She checked the scope settings and tested the bolt action, her father's voice echoing in her memory about the importance of knowing your weapon. This is insane, muttered PFC Martinez, but she was already checking her own gear to see what else Sarah might need. Maybe, agreed Sergeant Kim, but insane might be exactly what we need right now. He studied Sarah's face one more time. Doc, I need you to be completely honest with me. How confident are you that you can make this work? Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 12 lives in her hands. Sergeant, I've been shooting since I was 12 years old. I've taken elk at 400 yards in Montana winters with wind gusting to 30 miles per hour. The longest shot I ever made was a whitetail at nearly 600 yards. She paused, looking up at the ridge where muzzle flashes continued to flicker. But you're right, this isn't hunting. If I miss, if I give away my position, I might not get a second chance. And if you don't try, Charlie 2's wounded are definitely not getting a second chance, Corporal Washington pointed out grimly. Another explosion echoed from the direction of the burning vehicle, followed immediately by urgent radio chatter about casualties and ammunition running low. The decision was made for all of them. Martinez, give the doc your spare magazines, Sergeant Kim ordered. Washington, you're going to provide overwatch from here with the saw. Rodriguez, get on the radio and coordinate with the other vehicles. I need them to keep the insurgents focused on our positions down here while the doc makes her move. Sarah stripped off her borrowed body armor and helmet. They would be too bulky and noisy for the climb she was planning to make. She kept only the rifle, the spare ammunition, and her water bottle. Doc, once you're up there, you'll be completely on your own, Sergeant Kim explained as she prepared to leave the vehicle. We'll do everything we can to keep them busy down here, but you'll need to move fast and shoot straight. I understand, Sarah replied, checking the rifle one final time. The M14's .308 caliber round was more than adequate for what she needed to do, and the scope was better than anything she had used back home. How will I know when to take the shot? Trust your judgment, Kim answered. You'll be able to see the whole battlefield from up there. Pick the target that will make the biggest difference, and don't hesitate when you have the shot. Sarah nodded and moved toward the vehicle's rear exit. Before she opened it, she paused and looked back at the Marines who were putting their trust in a civilian academic with no military training. Bring our boys home, Doc, Sergeant Rodriguez said quietly. The next few minutes were the longest of Sarah's life. She slipped out of the armored vehicle during a lull in the fighting and immediately began working her way toward the base of the western ridge. The Marines increased their rate of fire to cover her movement, drawing the insurgents' attention away from her route. The terrain was rougher than it had appeared from the vehicle. Loose rocks shifted under her feet, and the sparse vegetation offered little concealment. Every shadow looked like a potential threat, and every sound seemed amplified in her ears. She found herself moving with the same careful deliberation she had learned during hunting trips, testing each step before committing her weight. The climb was steeper than she had anticipated, and the desert heat made every breath feel like fire in her lungs. Her academic lifestyle had not prepared her for this kind of physical exertion, especially while carrying a rifle and trying to move silently. Sweat dripped into her eyes, making it difficult to see, but she pressed on, driven by the knowledge that Marines were wounded and under fire below. Halfway up the slope, she paused behind a large boulder to catch her breath and assess her progress. The firefight continued below, but she could hear the subtle changes in the sound that told her the Marines were running low on ammunition. The insurgent fire was becoming more aggressive, and she could see movement among the rocks as they tried to advance to better positions. Sarah resumed her climb, moving from cover to cover as her father had taught her when stalking game. She used every available piece of terrain to mask her movement, always thinking 3 steps ahead about where she would go next. The hunting skills that had seemed irrelevant to her academic career were now literally matters of life and death. As she neared the top of the ridge, she could hear voices speaking in a language she didn't recognize. The insurgents were close, perhaps only 50 meters away on the other side of the rocky outcropping she was hiding behind. She forced herself to move even more slowly, knowing that a single loose rock or careless step could give away her position. The final approach required her to crawl on her belly across rough ground, pushing the rifle ahead of her. The rocks cut through her clothes and scraped her skin, but she barely noticed. Her entire world had narrowed to the immediate tactical problem of getting into position without being detected. When she finally reached a spot where she could see the insurgent positions, Sarah's breath caught in her throat. There were more of them than the initial reports had suggested, at least 10 fighters spread among several rocky positions along the eastern ridge. They had positioned themselves expertly, with overlapping fields of fire and good escape routes. Several of them were armed with RPGs, and she could see more rockets ready to fire at the pinned-down Marines below. Sarah settled into a stable shooting position behind a low stone wall that provided both cover and a solid rest for her rifle. She could see the entire battlefield spread out below her, including the burning lead vehicle where Marines were still trying to extract their wounded comrades under fire. Through the rifle scope, she could see individual insurgents clearly. Most were focused on the Marines below, but a few were scanning other directions, watching for exactly the kind of flanking maneuver she was attempting. She would have to be careful about her target selection and timing. Her first priority had to be the RPG teams. The rocket-propelled grenades were the greatest threat to the armored vehicles and the Marines taking cover behind them. She identified 3 insurgents who appeared to be preparing to fire more rockets at the convoy. Sarah controlled her breathing the way her father had taught her, settling into the zone of concentration she remembered from countless hunting trips. The noise of the battle faded into background as she focused on wind direction, range estimation, and target selection. The distance was approximately 350 meters, well within her capability, but requiring precise shot placement. She chose her first target carefully, an insurgent who was clearly the leader, directing the others and preparing to fire an RPG at the rescue efforts around the burning vehicle. Sarah centered the crosshairs on his torso, compensated for the slight crosswind, and slowly squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report echoed across the valley, and Sarah watched through the scope as her target dropped immediately. The other insurgents reacted with confusion, unsure where the shot had come from. They began looking in all directions, their organized fire becoming scattered and less effective. Sarah worked the bolt smoothly and acquired her second target, another RPG gunner who was trying to locate her position. The second shot dropped him before he could fire his rocket, causing even more confusion among the remaining insurgents. The third shot eliminated the insurgent who appeared to be trying to organize a response to her attack. With their leadership disrupted and their heavy weapons neutralized, the remaining fighters began to lose their coordination. From her elevated position, Sarah could see what the Marines below could not. Several insurgents were moving along the ridge, trying to flank the convoy from the north. She shifted her aim and began engaging these targets, each shot carefully placed and devastatingly effective. The insurgents' return fire was increasingly wild and uncoordinated. They knew someone was shooting at them from an unexpected direction, but they couldn't pinpoint her location among the rocks and shadows of the western ridge. Sarah used this confusion to her advantage, moving between shots to different firing positions and maintaining the element of surprise. Below in the valley, the Marines recognized that the pressure was shifting in their favor. Sergeant Kim's voice came over the radio, calm but urgent. Unknown marksman, this is Charlie 1. Excellent shooting. Can you maintain pressure while we advance on their positions? Sarah keyed the radio she had borrowed from one of the Marines. Charlie 1, this is the document. I can see movement on the northern end of the ridge. They're trying to flank you. I'll continue engaging from here. Copy that. Document outstanding work. Continue engaging as targets of opportunity present themselves. Sarah settled back into her shooting position, methodically working through the remaining insurgents. Each shot was a careful calculation of distance, wind, and target priority. She found herself falling back on not just her marksmanship skills, but her understanding of how animals move through terrain when they were wounded or frightened. Human beings, she realized, weren't that different when they were under pressure. The insurgents were now in full retreat, abandoning their prepared positions and tried to escape across the rugged terrain of the eastern ridge. Sarah continued to engage them as they fled, not out of bloodthirsty pursuit, but because she understood that every insurgent who escaped would potentially return to threaten other American forces later. Her ammunition was running low when she saw the last significant target, an insurgent who had managed to reach an escape route, but had stopped to fire one final RPG at the Marines advancing up the eastern slope. Sarah knew this would be her most difficult shot, at maximum range and with the target partially concealed behind rocks. She took extra time to steady her position and control her breathing. The crosshairs settled on the barely visible figure, and Sarah squeezed the trigger one final time. Through the scope, she saw the insurgent stumble and fall, his unfired RPG clattering harmlessly down the rocky slope. Silence fell over the battlefield. After nearly 30 minutes of intense combat, the sudden quiet was almost deafening. Sarah remained in position, scanning for any remaining threats, but the ridge appeared clear. All stations, this is Charlie 1. Sergeant Kim's voice came over the radio. Cease fire. Cease fire. Ridge appears secure. Charlie 2, what's your status? Charlie 2 has 2 urgent casualties and 1 routine, came the response. We need immediate medevac, but the landing zone is secure. Copy that, Charlie 2. Air support is inbound with medical evacuation. All units maintain security posture while we establish LZ. Sarah finally allowed herself to relax slightly, though she kept the rifle ready and continued to scan the terrain. Her hands were beginning to shake now that the immediate crisis was over, adrenaline giving way to the realization of what she had just done. The radio crackled again. Doc, this is Charlie 1. Outstanding shooting. Can you make it back down here safely? Affirmative, Charlie 1. Beginning descent now. The climb down was almost as treacherous as the ascent had been, complicated by exhaustion and the emotional aftermath of combat. Sarah moved carefully, knowing that a fall now would be both painful and embarrassing after everything she had just accomplished. When she finally reached the valley floor, she was immediately surrounded by Marines eager to congratulate her and verify that she was uninjured. Sergeant Kim took the rifle from her hands and checked her over with the concern of a big brother. "Doc, that was the best shooting I've ever seen in combat," he said seriously. "Where the hell did you learn to do that?" "Montana," Sarah replied simply, still struggling to process everything that had happened. The sound of approaching helicopters reminded everyone that the immediate situation was far from over. The wounded Marines needed medical attention, and the convoy still had to complete its mission safely. But for the moment, everyone was alive, and that was largely due to a visiting academic who had turned out to be far more than anyone had expected. As Sarah watched the Marines efficiently organize the medical evacuation and secure the area, she realized that her dissertation was going to need some major revisions. She had come to Afghanistan to study military logistics and supply chain management, but she had learned something much more important about the human factors that made those systems work. She had also learned something about herself that she never could have discovered in any classroom or research laboratory. The skills her father had taught her in the Montana wilderness weren't just about hunting game. They were about precision under pressure, patience in dangerous situations, and the ability to make life-or-death decisions when other people were counting on you. The medevac helicopter was landing now, its rotor wash stirring up clouds of dust that made everyone squint and cover their faces. Sarah watched as the wounded Marines were carefully loaded aboard, knowing that they would survive because of the action she had taken. It was a feeling unlike anything her academic achievements had ever given her. But even as she felt a sense of accomplishment, Sarah also understood that what she had done would have consequences far beyond this single engagement. Word of a civilian academic taking out an entire insurgent cell with a borrowed rifle was going to spread quickly through the military community. Her quiet research mission was about to become something much more complicated. Sergeant Kim appeared beside her as the helicopter lifted off with its precious cargo. "Doc, I need you to know something. What you did today saved lives. Not just the guys in Charlie 2, but probably a lot of other American forces who won't have to face those insurgents again." Sarah nodded, watching the helicopter disappear into the distance. "I understand, Sergeant. I just hope I never have to do anything like that again." "Roger that," Kim agreed. "But if you ever do, I'd be honored to serve with you again." As the convoy prepared to continue its mission, Sarah realized that her life had fundamentally changed. She was no longer just a visiting academic observer. She was now part of a story that would be told and retold throughout the Marine Corps, and that realization both thrilled and terrified her. The news of Dr. Sarah Chen's extraordinary performance in the Kandahar ambush spread through forward operating base Shank like wildfire. By the time the convoy returned to base that evening, half the personnel had already heard some version of the story. Most of them didn't believe it. Sarah found herself the center of unwanted attention as she tried to return to her quarters and process what had happened. Marines she had never met stopped her in the corridors, asking if the rumors were true. Officers who had barely acknowledged her presence during her first 3 days on base suddenly wanted detailed briefings about her background and capabilities. "Dr. Chun, could we have a word?" Colonel James Morrison, the base commander, intercepted her outside the mess hall. He was a tall, lean man with silver hair and the kind of steady presence that inspired confidence in subordinate officers. "My office, if you don't mind." Sarah followed him through the base's administrative area, past cubicles where intelligence analysts and support staff worked around the clock to support operations throughout the region. She had visited this building several times during her research, but never under circumstances like these. Colonel Morrison's office was spartanly decorated, with maps covering most of the wall space and a single photograph of his family on his desk. He gestured for Sarah to sit in one of the chairs facing his desk, then closed the door behind them. "Dr. Chun, I've just finished reading Sergeant Kim's after-action report." The colonel began without preamble. "It makes for interesting reading. According to his account, You single-handedly eliminated 8 confirmed insurgents at ranges up to 400 meters, using a weapon you had never fired before during your first exposure to combat. Yes, sir, Sarah replied carefully. That's accurate. Sergeant Kim also reports that your actions directly saved the lives of at least 4 Marines and prevented the destruction of additional vehicles and equipment. Colonel Morrison studied her face closely. These are extraordinary claims, Dr. Chun. I need to understand exactly what happened out there. For the next hour, Sarah walked the colonel through every detail of the engagement, from her initial observations about the terrain to her final shots at the escaping insurgents. Morrison listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, his expression giving away nothing of his thoughts. Dr. Chun, your official background check mentions that you're from Montana, but it doesn't include anything about military training or competitive shooting experience, Morrison observed when she finished her account. That's correct, sir. I have no military background. My shooting experience comes entirely from hunting with my father. Tell me about that experience. Sarah described her childhood in Montana, the hunting trips with her father, the long hours practicing marksmanship in various weather conditions and terrain. She explained how her father had been a perfectionist who insisted she understand not just how to shoot, but how to read wind and weather, judge distances, and remain calm under pressure. He was a Vietnam veteran, Sarah added. He never talked much about his service, but I think the way he taught me to hunt reflected some of his military training. He always emphasized patience, precision, and understanding your environment. Colonel Morrison leaned back in his chair, processing this information. Dr. Chun, I'm going to be direct with you. What happened today changes things. You're no longer just a civilian researcher observing our operations. You've demonstrated combat capabilities that frankly exceed those of many of our trained personnel. Sir, I'm not interested in becoming a combatant, Sarah said quickly. I came here to do research, not to get involved in fighting. I understand that, Morrison replied. But sometimes circumstances don't give us the luxury of choosing our roles. The question now is how we proceed from here. Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock on the office door. Colonel Morrison called for the visitor to enter, and Sarah was surprised to see a woman in Army uniform she didn't recognize. Colonel Morrison, Dr. Chun, the newcomer said briskly. I'm Major Lisa Park, U.S. Army Special Operations Command. I arrived here about an hour ago specifically to speak with Dr. Chun. Sarah felt her stomach drop. The presence of a special operations officer could only mean that word of her actions had already reached the highest levels of the military command structure. Major Park, we were just discussing Dr. Chen's situation, Colonel Morrison said. Please have a seat. Major Park was probably in her mid-30s with short brown hair and the kind of athletic build that suggested serious physical conditioning. Her uniform bore the subdued patches of multiple specialized units, and Sarah noticed immediately that she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to dangerous situations. Dr. Chun, I've been reading the reports of your engagement today, Major Park began. I have to say, your performance was remarkable. 8 confirmed kills at extended range, under combat conditions, with an unfamiliar weapon. That's the kind of marksmanship we typically see only from our most elite snipers. Major, I appreciate the compliment, but I'm a civilian researcher, Sarah protested. What happened today was an emergency situation. It's not something I want to make a habit of. I understand your position, Park replied, but I need you to understand something as well. The insurgents in this region have been operating with near impunity for months. They perfected the art of the ambush, using terrain and tactics that make them extremely difficult for our conventional forces to counter. She pulled out a tablet and showed Sarah a series of photographs and intelligence reports. In the past 6 months, this particular cell has been responsible for 14 separate attacks on coalition forces. They've killed or wounded 23 soldiers, destroyed millions of dollars in equipment, and generally made life miserable for every unit operating in this area. Sarah studied the intelligence reports, recognizing some of the terrain from her brief but intense exposure to combat. and today we eliminated them. According to our assessment, yes. The combination of your sniper fire and the Marines' ground assault broke up their organization completely. 3 confirmed dead on the ridge, 5 more eliminated during their attempted escape, and the remainder scattered to the winds without leadership or heavy weapons. Colonel Morrison nodded grimly. Dr. Chun, what you accomplished today will save American lives. Not just the Marines in that convoy, but every soldier who would have been targeted by that cell in the future. But it also creates new problems, Major Park continued. The insurgents now know that coalition forces have access to capabilities they didn't expect. They're going to adapt their tactics, probably by operating from longer ranges and using different approaches to their ambush sites. Sarah was beginning to understand where this conversation was heading. You want me to help counter those new tactics? Dr. Chun, let me be completely frank with you, Major Park said. The U.S. military has some of the best snipers in the world, but they're in high demand everywhere. We never have enough of them, and they're constantly being deployed to the most dangerous situations across multiple theaters. She leaned forward, her expression serious. What you demonstrated today suggests that you have natural abilities that could be developed into truly exceptional skills. With proper training and equipment, you could potentially be more effective than most of our conventional snipers. I'm not a soldier, Sarah repeated. I'm a researcher. I have a life, a career, obligations back home. I understand that, Colonel Morrison interjected. Major Park isn't suggesting you abandon your civilian life and enlist in the military. But there might be other options. Major Park nodded. The Department of Defense has several programs that allow civilian experts to contribute to military operations on a consulting basis. You could potentially continue your research while also providing specialized capabilities when needed. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the implications of what they were discussing. A few hours ago, she had been a graduate student taking notes about logistics. Now senior military officers were discussing ways to integrate her into their operational planning. I need time to think about this, she said finally. Of course, Major Park agreed. But I want you to consider something. The skills you demonstrated today could potentially save dozens or even hundreds of American lives. That's not a responsibility to take lightly. It's also not a responsibility I asked for, Sarah pointed out. No, Colonel Morrison acknowledged. But sometimes the most important responsibilities are the ones we don't ask for. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside the office. They could hear raised voices and the sound of people moving quickly through the corridors. Colonel Morrison immediately picked up his radio to check with the base operations center. Sir, we've got an urgent situation developing, came the response. Intelligence indicates possible coordinated attacks on 3 different patrol routes. Multiple units are requesting immediate sniper support, but our assets are already committed elsewhere. Major Park and Colonel Morrison exchanged significant looks. Dr. Chun, Park said quietly, would you be willing to help with this situation? Sarah felt the weight of decision pressing down on her. Every instinct told her to refuse, to stick to her role as a civilian observer and let the military professionals handle their own problems. But she also thought about the Marines who had welcomed her into their unit, who had trusted her with their lives, and who were now facing similar dangers in other parts of the region. What exactly are you asking me to do? She said finally. There's a patrol that's been cut off about 15 kilometers from here, Colonel Morrison explained. They're taking fire from insurgents in a fortified position that our air support can engage without risking civilian casualties. We need someone who can neutralize the threats with precision fire. The insertion would be by helicopter to a position approximately 800 meters from the target, Major Park added. You'd have Marine spotters to help with target identification and protection and immediate extraction once the mission is complete. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to process everything that was happening to her. This morning she had been worried about getting enough data for her dissertation. Tonight she was being asked to undertake a combat mission that could determine whether American soldiers lived or died. If I agree to this, she said slowly, what happens afterward? Do I become some kind of military asset? Do I lose control over my own life? Dr. Chun, you're a civilian, Colonel Morrison assured her. You can't be ordered to do anything. Every mission would be voluntary, and you could withdraw from any arrangement at any time. But, Major Park added, once word of your capabilities spreads through the special operations community, you're likely to receive a lot of requests for assistance. Your expertise could become very much in demand. Sarah thought about the wounded Marines she had seen loaded onto the medical evacuation helicopter, about the fear in their eyes as they waited for rescue, about the relief on their faces when the shooting stopped. She thought about other units facing similar situations, other young soldiers whose lives might depend on capabilities they didn't know existed. "Well, I need to know about this mission," she asked. Major Park smiled for the first time since entering the office. "Let's go to the briefing room, and I'll show you exactly what we're dealing with." As they walked through the base toward the intelligence center, Sarah realized that her life had just taken another dramatic turn. She was no longer just a civilian who had been forced into combat by circumstances. She was now actively choosing to engage in military operations, and that choice would define everything that came after. The briefing room was filled with intelligence analysts, communication specialists, and planning officers working on multiple operations simultaneously. Large screens showed real-time feeds from unmanned aircraft, and Sarah could see the positions of various American units scattered across the region. "Here's the situation," Major Park began, pointing to one of the displays. "Bravo Company, 2nd Platoon, is pinned down in this valley. They were conducting a routine patrol when they encountered a well-prepared defensive position here on this ridgeline." Sarah studied the terrain displayed on the screen, noting the similarities to the area where she had engaged the insurgents earlier that day. "How many enemy fighters are we dealing with?" "Intelligence estimates between 6 and 10 armed with automatic weapons and possibly RPGs. They're in reinforced positions that have been prepared over time, which makes them difficult to assault directly." "What about air support?" "The problem is this." Major Park indicated a small building complex near the insurgent positions. "Local intelligence indicates this is a school with civilian personnel inside. We can't use close air support without risking civilian casualties." Sarah nodded, understanding the tactical problem immediately. "So you need precision fire that can eliminate the insurgents without endangering the civilians." "Exactly. The shot distances would be between 300 and 600 meters, depending on which position we can establish for you." "What kind of equipment would I have?" Major Park gestured to an adjoining room where several Marines were preparing gear. "We can provide you with the best rifle system in our inventory, along with proper spotting equipment and communications gear. You'd also have 2 Marine Scout snipers to assist with target identification and security." Sarah walked into the equipment room and examined the rifle they were preparing for her. It was a more advanced system than the M14 she had used earlier, with a high-powered scope and precision-manufactured ammunition. The Marines working on the equipment looked up as she entered, and she could see both respect and curiosity in their expressions. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant First Class Tom Bradley," one of them said. "I'll be your primary spotter for this mission. I have to say, what you did today was incredible." "Thank you, Sergeant. I'm still learning about all of this myself." "Yes, ma'am. But from what I heard, you've got natural instincts that can't be taught. That's worth more than all the training in the world." Sarah picked up the rifle and examined its features. It was heavier than what she was used to, but the balance felt good in her hands. The scope was more sophisticated than anything she had ever used, with multiple settings for different ranges and environmental conditions. "How long do we have to prepare for this mission?" she asked. "The patrol has been pinned down for about 40 minutes, Sergeant Bradley replied. "They're in good defensive positions for now, but ammunition and water are going to become issues if this drags on much longer." Sarah nodded, feeling the familiar pressure of people depending on her decisions. But this time, instead of panic, she felt a growing sense of confidence. The equipment was better than anything she had ever used. She would have professional support, and she understood now what she was capable of under pressure. "All right," she said finally. "Let's go help those Marines." The helicopter ride to the mission area was Sarah's first time flying in a military aircraft, and the experience was both exhilarating and terrifying. The UH-60 Black Hawk flew low and fast across the darkening Afghan landscape, its crew maintaining radio silence while scanning for threats. Sarah sat between her two Marine spotters, Sergeant First Class Bradley and Corporal Mike Santos, both experienced scout snipers who had been hastily briefed on their unusual mission. "Doc, you doing okay?" Sergeant Bradley asked through the helicopter's intercom system as they approached the insertion point. "I'm fine," Sarah replied, though her stomach was churning from a combination of motion sickness and nervous anticipation. "How close will we be to the friendly forces?" "About 1,200 meters, Corporal Santos answered. "Close enough that we can coordinate with them by radio, but far enough that we won't accidentally engage them if things get confusing." Sarah checked her equipment one final time. The rifle they had given her was a precision instrument, a .300 Winchester Magnum, with a high-powered scope capable of effective engagement at ranges far beyond what she had ever attempted. The ammunition was match-grade, manufactured to tolerances that guaranteed consistency shot after shot. 2 minutes to insertion, the helicopter crew chief announced. "Remember, we're going in fast and getting out fast. The LZ is only secure as long as the insurgents don't know we're here." Through the helicopter's windows, Sarah could see the terrain they would be operating in. It was similar to the area from her morning engagement, but more complex, with multiple ridgelines and valleys that provided both opportunities and challenges for long-range shooting. "There's the school." Sergeant Bradley pointed to a cluster of buildings visible in the distance. "Intel says there are about 20 civilians inside, mostly children and teachers. That's why air support is off the table." Sarah studied the building through her scope, noting its proximity to the insurgent positions. The margin for error would be essentially zero. Any shot that missed its intended target could potentially strike the school, and cause exactly the kind of civilian casualties they were trying to avoid. 30 seconds, the crew chief called out. The helicopter flared hard as it approached a small clearing surrounded by rocky outcroppings. Before Sarah could fully process what was happening, the aircraft had touched down, and the Marines were already moving. She followed Sergeant Bradley and Corporal Santos out of the helicopter, keeping low as the rotor wash whipped dust and debris around them. The Black Hawk was airborne again within seconds, leaving the three-person team alone in the gathering darkness. Sarah felt a moment of profound isolation as the sound of the helicopter faded into the distance, replaced by the much more ominous sound of gunfire echoing from the valley ahead of them. "This way, Doc," Sergeant Bradley whispered, leading them toward a rocky ridge that would provide both concealment and a clear view of the target area. "We need to get into position quickly. The pinned-down patrol is running low on ammunition." The climb to their firing position was different from Sarah's solo movement earlier in the day. The two Marines moved with professional efficiency, using hand signals to communicate and automatically covering different sectors as they advanced. Sarah found herself adapting to their rhythm, her earlier experience giving her confidence to move quietly through the rocky terrain. "Contact front," Corporal Santos whispered as they approached their planned position. "I can see muzzle flashes from the insurgent positions." Sarah settled into a stable shooting position behind a low stone wall, with Sergeant Bradley beside her operating a spotting scope. Corporal Santos positioned himself slightly behind them, watching their flanks and maintaining radio contact with both the pinned-down patrol and their command center. "Talk to me about what you see," Sergeant Bradley said quietly, his voice professionally calm despite the ongoing firefight below them. Sarah studied the terrain through her rifle scope, taking time to understand the tactical situation before making any shots. The insurgents had indeed prepared their positions well, with multiple fighting positions connected by covered routes that allowed them to move without being seen from the valley floor. "I count 6 separate positions," she whispered. "Looks like 2 or 3 fighters in each one. They're using coordinated fire to keep the Marines pinned down, while some of them try to maneuver for better angles." "Good eye," Bradley confirmed. What's your assessment of the range? Sarah used the scope's ranging reticle to estimate distances to the various targets. Primary positions are between 400 and 500 meters. The ones trying to flank are closer, maybe 350. When Sarah observed the movement of dust and vegetation, feeling the breeze on her face. Light crosswind from the east, maybe 5 miles per hour. Not enough to significantly affect the trajectory at these ranges. Outstanding. You're thinking like a professional already. Bradley adjusted his spotting scope to match Sarah's view. Which target do you want to engage first? Sarah studied the tactical situation carefully, thinking about which shot would have the greatest impact on the overall engagement. There's a position on the left that seems to be directing the others. I can see someone with what looks like a radio, and the firing from the other position changes based on signals from that location. I concur. That's probably their squad leader or senior fighter. Taking him out should disrupt their coordination. Sarah settled into her shooting position, controlling her breathing and allowing her heart rate to slow down despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. The target was partially concealed behind rocks, with only his head and shoulders visible as he moved between giving orders and engaging the Marines below. Range 420 meters, Bradley whispered. Light crosswind from the east. Target is moving, but following a pattern. He shows himself for about 5 seconds every 30 seconds or so. I see the pattern, Sarah confirmed. I'll take the shot on his next exposure. She centered the crosshairs on the spot where the insurgent leader would appear, led the target slightly to account for the crosswind, and controlled her breathing. When the figure appeared exactly where she expected, Sarah squeezed the trigger smoothly. The rifle's report echoed across the valley, and through the scope, Sarah saw the insurgent leader drop immediately. The effect on the other fighters was immediate and dramatic. Their coordinated fire became ragged and confused, with different positions shooting at different targets without any apparent overall plan. Clean hit, Bradley confirmed. Nice shooting, document target down, and not moving. Bravo 2-6, this is Overwatch. Corporal Santos spoke into his radio. Be advised, enemy leader neutralized. Expect disruption in their fire coordination. Copy, Overwatch, came the response from the pinned-down patrol. We can already see the difference. Their fire is much less accurate. Sarah worked the bolt and acquired her next target, an insurgent who was trying to establish control over the confused fighters. This shot was at a longer range, nearly 500 meters, but the target was more exposed as he moved between positions trying to rally his comrades. The second shot was even more precise than the first, dropping the target before he could reach cover. With their primary and secondary leadership eliminated, the remaining insurgents began to lose their tactical discipline entirely. Outstanding shooting, Bradley observed. You're disrupting their entire command structure. Keep working on the ones who are trying to take charge. Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah methodically eliminated the insurgents who posed the greatest threat to the trapped Marines. Each shot was carefully calculated, taking into account not just the ballistics, but the tactical situation and the need to avoid any risk to the civilian school nearby. Overwatch, Bravo 2-6, the radio crackled. Enemy fire has decreased significantly. We're seeing movement that looks like they might be trying to withdraw. Copy, Bravo 2-6, Santos replied. Overwatch has eyes on possible withdrawal routes. We'll continue to engage as targets present themselves. Sarah shifted her focus to the insurgents who were indeed attempting to escape their prepared positions. Her earlier experience had taught her that retreating enemies could regroup and return to fight again, potentially threatening other American forces in the future. There's a group moving along that ridgeline to the north, she told Bradley. Looks like they're trying to reach that ravine where our air support can't see them. I have eyes on them, Bradley confirmed. Range approximately 600 meters and increasing. Can you make that shot? 600 meters was at the extreme edge of what Sarah had ever attempted, even under ideal conditions. With a moving target in fading light, it represented a significant challenge. But She also understood that allowing these insurgents to escape would mean other American soldiers would face them again under different circumstances. "I can try," she said, adjusting her scope for the increased range and studying the wind conditions carefully. The shot required her to lead the moving targets significantly, accounting for both their movement and the longer flight time of the bullet at extended range. Sarah took extra time to ensure her position was perfectly stable, using her shooting sling and natural bone support to create the steadiest platform possible. The rifle cracked, and several seconds later Sarah saw one of the fleeing insurgents stumble and fall. The others immediately scattered in different directions, abandoning any attempt at organized withdrawal. "Excellent shot," Bradley exclaimed quietly. "I can't believe you made that hit at that range with a moving target." "Sometimes you get lucky," Sarah replied, though she felt a growing confidence in her abilities that went beyond luck. "That wasn't luck, document. That was skill." The engagement continued for another hour as Sarah picked off individual insurgents who were trying to escape or reposition themselves for continued fighting. By the time full darkness fell, the threat had been completely eliminated. "Bravo 2-6, this is Overwatch," Santos reported. "All enemy positions appear silent. No movement detected in the target area for the past 15 minutes. Copy, Overwatch. We're beginning our advance to secure the objective area. Outstanding support tonight. You saved our bacon." "Roger that, Bravo 2-6. Glad we could help." As they waited for their extraction helicopter, Sarah found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that morning. She had now participated in 2 major combat engagements in a single day, demonstrating capabilities she had never known she possessed. "Doc, can I ask you something?" Sergeant Bradley said as they prepared their equipment for extraction. "Of course. How does it feel? I mean, you went from being a civilian researcher to taking out more insurgents in one day than most Marines see in an entire deployment." Sarah considered the question carefully. "It feels surreal," she admitted. "This morning I was worried about my dissertation committee and whether I had enough data for my research. Tonight, I'm sitting on a mountain in Afghanistan having just used a high-powered rifle to eliminate enemy combatants. But how does it feel emotionally?" Bradley pressed. "Killing people, I mean, even when they're trying to kill your friends." "I don't know yet," Sarah answered honestly. "Right now I'm focused on the fact that there are Marines going home to their families tonight who might not have if we hadn't been here. The rest of it, the philosophical and emotional aspects, I'll probably be processing for a long time." Corporal Santos nodded approvingly. "That's a healthy attitude, Doc. The guys who worry me are the ones who either love it too much or feel nothing at all. You're showing exactly the kind of response I'd expect from someone with a good moral compass." The sound of an approaching helicopter interrupted their conversation. Within minutes, they were airborne again, flying back toward forward operating base, Shank through the darkness. Sarah looked down at the terrain below, thinking about the men who had died that day and the Marines who had lived because of her actions. As they approached the base, she could see lights and activity that suggested word of the mission's success had already arrived. She realized that her second successful engagement would only intensify the interest in her capabilities from higher military authorities. "Doc," Sergeant Bradley said over the helicopter's intercom, "I want you to know that it's been an honor working with you today. You've got skills that most of our people can only dream about, and you use them for the right reasons." "Thank you, Sergeant. I learned a lot from both of you as well." "One more thing," Bradley added. "Whatever you decide about whether to continue doing this kind of work, just remember that you've already saved more American lives than most people ever get the chance to. That's something to be proud of, regardless of what comes next." As the helicopter settled onto the landing pad at Forward Operating Base Shank, Sarah knew that Sergeant Bradley was right. She had saved lives, and that would always be meaningful regardless of how complicated her situation had become. But she also knew that the most difficult decisions were still ahead of her. The military clearly wanted to find ways to utilize her unique capabilities, and she was beginning to understand the responsibility that came with possessing skills that could make such a significant difference in life or death situations. The helicopter's engines wound down, and Sarah prepared to face whatever new challenges awaited her. In less than 24 hours, she had gone from being an unknown civilian researcher to being one of the most effective combat marksmen in the entire region. Now, she had to figure out what that meant for the rest of her life. 3 weeks after the first engagement, Sarah found herself in a situation she never could have imagined. She sat in a secure conference room at Bagram Airfield, the largest American military installation in Afghanistan, facing a panel of senior military officers from multiple branches of service. The room was filled with enough ribbons, stars, and combat decorations to outfit a small army, and every person present was there specifically to discuss her future. "Dr. Chun," began General Patricia Williams, a stern-looking woman who commanded all special operations forces in Afghanistan. "Your performance over the past month has been remarkable. 5 successful engagements, 37 confirmed enemy casualties, 0 collateral damage, and, most importantly, 0 American casualties in any operation where you provided overwatch." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. The numbers sounded clinical when stated that way, but each one represented specific moments she would never forget. Faces seen through rifle scopes, split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death, and the constant weight of knowing that people were depending on her accuracy. "General, I appreciate the recognition," Sarah replied carefully, "but I want to reiterate that my primary purpose for being in Afghanistan was research, not combat operations." "Was research," corrected Colonel Morrison, who had flown in from Forward Operating Base Shank specifically for this meeting. "Dr. Chun, I think we're past pretending that your situation hasn't fundamentally changed." Major Park, who had become Sarah's primary liaison with the special operations community, opened a thick folder on the table. "Dr. Chun, we've received requests for your assistance from 17 different units across 3 provinces. The insurgents have started referring to you in their communications as the Ghost Sniper because they can't figure out how one person is showing up at so many different locations. Which brings us to why we're having this conversation," General Williams continued. "The Department of Defense wants to formalize your relationship with our operations. We're prepared to offer you a civilian contractor position that would allow you to maintain your academic career while providing specialized support to our forces when needed." Sarah looked around the room at the assembled officers, each of whom had spent decades serving their country in various capacities. She understood the honor implicit in their offer, but she also felt the weight of what accepting would mean for her life. "What exactly would this position entail?" she asked. Major Park handed her a detailed briefing document. "You would retain your civilian status and continue your research as planned. However, you would also be on call to provide sniper support for high-priority operations when requested. We estimate no more than 1 or 2 missions per month with full support teams and the best equipment available. The compensation would be substantial," added a civilian official Sarah hadn't met before. "Significantly more than most academic positions, with full medical and life insurance coverage and educational benefits if you choose to pursue additional degrees." "Money isn't my primary concern," Sarah said honestly. "My concern is whether this is the right thing to do, both for me personally and for the bigger picture." "Can you elaborate on that?" General Williams asked. Sarah took a deep breath, organizing thoughts she had been wrestling with for weeks. "I came to Afghanistan to study how military organizations achieve efficiency under difficult conditions. What I've learned is that the most important factor isn't systems or equipment, it's the people and their willingness to make sacrifices for each other." She paused, looking at each officer in turn. "I've seen Marines risk their lives to rescue wounded comrades. I've watched helicopter pilots fly into dangerous situations to extract people they've never met. I've witnessed extraordinary courage and selflessness on a daily basis." "And your point is?" Colonel Morrison pointed. "My point is that if I have capabilities that can save American lives, then maybe I have a responsibility to use them, regardless of whether it was part of my original plan." The room fell silent as the officers absorbed this statement. General Williams leaned forward, studying Sarah's face intently. Dr. Chun, that's a mature and thoughtful perspective. But I need to know that you're making this decision based on a realistic understanding of what it would entail. This isn't an academic exercise. People will continue to try to kill you, and you will continue to have to kill them. I understand that, General. Over the past month, I've learned things about myself that I never expected to learn. I've discovered that I can function under extreme pressure, that I can make life or death decisions quickly and accurately, and that I can live with the consequences of those decisions. And how do you feel about those consequences? Asked a Navy captain Sarah hadn't been introduced to. Complex, Sarah admitted. I don't enjoy taking lives, but I understand that in these situations, there often isn't a choice between violence and nonviolence. There's only a choice between who lives and who dies. Given that reality, I'd rather be in a position to influence the outcome than to stand by helplessly while good people suffer. Major Park nodded approvingly. Dr. Chun, that's exactly the kind of mindset we need in people who undertake these missions. It shows both moral clarity and emotional maturity. However, General Williams added, I want to make sure you understand that accepting this position would change your life permanently. You would become a high-value target for insurgent organizations. Your identity and capabilities would become known to enemy intelligence networks. There would always be an element of risk, even when you're not on active missions. Sarah had thought about this aspect extensively. General, I think that ship has already sailed. The insurgents are already aware that someone with unusual capabilities is operating against them. Whether I formalize my relationship with the military or not, I'm probably already a target. That's unfortunately true, confirmed the Navy captain. Our intelligence indicates that several insurgent groups have placed bounties on information leading to the identification of the person they're calling the Ghost Sniper, which actually makes the case for formalizing your status even stronger, Major Park added. As a contractor, you'd have access to much better security resources and protection protocols. Sarah looked down at the contract documents spread on the table before her. 3 weeks ago, she had been worried about completing her dissertation on time. Now she was being offered a position that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her entire life. Can I ask you something? Sarah said to General Williams. Of course. Do you think this is the right decision? Not from a military perspective, but from a human perspective. Should a civilian academic really be making the transition to this kind of work? General Williams considered the question for a long moment before responding. Dr. Chun, I've been in the military for 28 years. I've seen a lot of people try to make the transition from civilian life to combat operations, and I've seen a lot of them fail because they couldn't handle the psychological pressure. She leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. But I've also seen natural warriors who discovered their calling in the most unexpected circumstances. People who had never thought of themselves as combatants, but who possessed innate abilities that made them extraordinarily effective when circumstances required it. And which category do you think I fall into? Based on your performance over the past month, and more importantly, based on your attitude and decision-making process, I think you're the latter. You have natural abilities that can't be taught, and you're using them for the right reasons in the right ways. But, General Williams continued, that's ultimately a decision only you can make. We can offer you opportunities and support, but we can't make this choice for you. Sarah looked around the room one more time, thinking about all the factors that should influence her decision. Her academic career, her family back in Montana, her personal safety, and the broader implications of what she would be agreeing to do. If I accept this position, she said finally, what will be my first assignment? Major Park smiled. Actually, we have a situation developing right now that could use your particular expertise. Intelligence indicates that a high-value target, someone who's been coordinating insurgent operations across multiple provinces, is meeting with local cell leaders in a compound about 50 kilometers from here. The problem is that conventional assault would likely result in significant casualties on both sides, and the target would probably escape in the confusion, added Colonel Morrison. But A precision engagement from long range could eliminate the threat with minimal risk to our forces. What's the range? Sarah asked. Approximately 700 meters from the nearest concealed position to the target building, Major Park replied. It will be challenging, but well within the capabilities you've already demonstrated. Sarah felt a familiar sensation, the same combination of nervous excitement and focused determination she had experienced before each of her previous missions. Despite the magnitude of the decision she was being asked to make, part of her was already thinking through the tactical challenges of a 700-meter shot in whatever environmental conditions they would face. When would this mission take place? Tomorrow night, if you're available. Sarah looked down at the contract documents again, then back up at the expectant faces around the table. In the space of a few weeks, she had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed and found herself in a position to make a real difference in a conflict that mattered to people she had come to care about. General Williams, she said, I need you to promise me something. What's that? Promise me that if I ever lose perspective, if I ever start making decisions for the wrong reasons, or stop being the kind of person who should be trusted with these capabilities, someone will have the courage to tell me. You have my word on that, Dr. Chun. Sarah picked up the pen that had been placed beside the contract documents. In that case, I accept your offer. As she signed her name to the papers that would formalize her new role, Sarah reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment. She had come to Afghanistan to study military logistics and supply chain management. Instead, she had discovered that sometimes the most important contributions come not from research and analysis, but from being willing to step up when circumstances demand it. Welcome to the team, Dr. Chun, General Williams said as Sarah finished signing the documents. I think you're going to find this work both challenging and rewarding. Thank you, General. I'm looking forward to making a difference. You already have, Major Park added, but I have a feeling this is just the beginning. 3 hours later, Sarah found herself back in a planning room, studying intelligence photos and terrain maps for her first official mission as a Department of Defense contractor. The target was indeed a high-value individual whose elimination would significantly disrupt insurgent operations across the region. But as she prepared for what would be her most challenging shot to date, Sarah realized that the technical aspects of the mission were the least of her concerns. She had successfully transitioned from being a visiting academic observer to being an integral part of the American military effort in Afghanistan. More importantly, she had discovered something about herself that no classroom or research project could have taught her. When circumstances demanded it, when people she cared about were in danger, she was capable of rising to challenges she had never imagined facing. The young woman who had nervously adjusted her borrowed helmet during that first convoy patrol had evolved into someone who could make life-or-death decisions under extreme pressure and live with the consequences. It wasn't the career path she had planned, but as she studied the mission materials for her next engagement, Sarah knew it was exactly where she belonged. Tomorrow night, she would take the longest, most difficult shot of her life. But tonight, for the first time since arriving in Afghanistan, she felt completely certain about who she was and what she was meant to do. The visiting academic had found her calling in the most unexpected place imaginable, and she was ready to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead.